The silence in Blackwood Manor was a living thing. It was a pressure in the ears, a weight on the chest, a cold dust that settled on every gilded surface and smothered the light. It had been this way for 4 years, a creeping rot that began the day the Duchess Eleanor had been cast out, and which now had its heart in the nursery. Alistair Beaumont, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, stood outside his son's door and listened to the silence. It was a temporary, fragile truce, holding its breath before the inevitable nightly war. He was a man who commanded fortunes and felled forests with a word, whose name carried the weight of 7 centuries of power. Yet for the past year, he had been defeated nightly by the terror that lived inside a 5-year-old boy. The door creaked open. Dr. Holloway, a man whose fashionable London practice was built on soothing the nerves of hysterical ladies, emerged looking haggard and defeated. His cravat was askew, his face pale in the flickering gaslight of the corridor. "No change, Your Grace," the doctor whispered, his voice thin with exhaustion. "I administered the laudanum tincture, a very small dose, as you instructed. He fought it. He seems to fear sleep itself. Once he finally succumbed, the nightmares began within the hour." Alistair's hands, clasped behind his back, tightened until the knuckles were white stones. He screamed again. It was not a question. "For his mother," Holloway confirmed, his gaze dropping to the floor, unable to meet the Duke's cold grey eyes. It was the one name never spoken aloud in this house, a ghost whose presence was more powerful than any living soul within its walls. "Always for his mother." Alistair gave a curt, dismissive nod. "Your efforts have been noted, Doctor. You may go." He did not watch the man retreat down the long, portrait-lined hall. He was merely another in a long line of failures. Physicians, specialists, nannies flown in from Vienna, even a grim-faced woman who claimed to be able to reason with spirits. All had failed to give his son, Theodore, a single night of peace. He pushed open the nursery door. The room was a monument to his desperation. The finest toys from Germany lay untouched in their boxes. Books with brightly painted pictures were stacked, unread. In the center of the vast chamber, in a bed built like a miniature fortress, lay his son. Theo was a small, pale replica of Alistair himself, with the same dark hair and determined chin. But his son had his mother's eyes. Wide, terrified, and the color of a summer sky, they were staring at the canopy above him, tracking horrors only he could see. A sheen of sweat slicked his hair to his forehead. His small hands were clenched around a worn wooden soldier, its paint rubbed away by years of frantic gripping. "Father?" The voice was a thread of sound, frayed by screaming. Alistair moved to the bedside, his movements stiff and unnatural. He was a stranger in this room, an intruder in his son's grief. He smoothed a hand over Theo's damp hair. The boy flinched. "I am here," Alistair said, the words sounding hollow and useless. "The shadows have teeth," Theo whispered. "They want to eat me." Guilt, sharp and acidic, flooded Alistair's throat. He had created this. He had ripped the sun from his son's world and then commanded him not to be afraid of the dark. The lie he had built his life upon for the last 4 years was a foundation of sand, and now the tide was coming in, washing it all away from beneath his feet. The letters, the whispers from his cousin Marcus, the cold, righteous fury he had nurtured, it all felt like a stage play viewed from a great distance. The only reality was this terrified child. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress barely dipping under his weight. He was a titan of industry and politics, yet he did not know how to comfort his own flesh and blood. He could not remember the last time he had held his son without a sense of performing a duty. The screaming started again, half an hour later. It was not a child's cry of frustration, but a raw, primal shriek of absolute terror that clawed its way through the walls of the manor. It echoed in the marble entry hall, vibrated through the floorboards of the empty ballroom, and found its way down to the servants' quarters in the belly of the great house. Down in the kitchens, a woman known as Nora dropped the potato she was peeling. The sound of the scream was a physical blow, a hot poker pressed against her heart. She froze, her knuckles white on the edge of the wooden table. The other servants, long accustomed to the nightly ritual, merely sighed and carried on with their work. "Poor little mite," murmured Cook, her face grim. "It's a wonder his heart can take it." "The Duke will be in a state," another maid muttered, polishing a silver platter with more vigor than necessary. "He'll have the whole house up again." Nora said nothing. She had been at Blackwood for 3 weeks, a new scullery maid hired on the recommendation of a village vicar. She was quiet, efficient, and kept to herself. Her face was thin, her hands were chapped and red, and her eyes held a weariness that went far beyond her presumed years. No one paid her much mind. She was just Nora, another cog in the vast machine of the household. But Nora was a lie. Her real name was Eleanor, and the boy screaming upstairs was her son. Every shriek was a nail driven into her soul. She had come here on a desperate, suicidal gamble. After 4 years of exile, of scrubbing floors in filthy inns and taking in mending for pennies, she had heard whispers. Whispers of the Duke of Blackwood's troubled heir, a boy plagued by night terrors, a boy who called for his mother. Her heart, which she thought had turned to stone, had cracked open. She had to see him, just once, to know that he was real, that he was breathing. So she had used the last of her savings to buy a decent dress, invented a new past, and found a way into the lion's den. Seeing him from a distance in the garden had been a torment. He was so tall, so pale. Her baby, now a little boy, haunted by ghosts, she could not fight for him. Tonight, the sound of his pain was more than she could bear. It broke through the wall of detached survival she had built around herself for 4 years. She set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out of the kitchen. She moved through the back passages of the house, a ghost in her own home. The corridors were familiar, yet alien. She had once glided along them in silk. Now her worn leather shoes made no sound on the runner. She knew every shortcut, every loose floorboard. She had explored this house as a young, hopeful bride, full of dreams that had since been ground to dust. The screaming grew louder, more frantic. It was a homing beacon. She found herself at the base of the main staircase, the one she was forbidden to use. The sound was coming from directly above. Without a second thought, she began to climb, one hand on the cold, polished oak of the banister. She reached the upper landing, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The door to the nursery was ajar. Light and shadow danced within. She could hear Alistair's voice, low and tense, trying to reason with a terror that had no reason. "Theodore, listen to me. There is nothing there. It is just a dream." "She's gone. They took her," Theo wailed, the word sharp with hysteria. "The shadows took her." Eleanor's breath hitched. She pressed herself against the wall, her rough wool dress catching on the silk damask wallpaper. She should not be here. If she was discovered, she would be thrown out, and this time she might be arrested. She would never see him again. But his cries were a physical pull, a rope tied around her very being. He was calling for her. She took a step, then another. She was a shadow herself, moving towards the light. She slipped through the gap in the door, her eyes adjusting to the dim light of the single lamp beside the bed. Alistair had his back to her. He was leaning over Theo, his broad shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. Theo was thrashing, his small body rigid with fear, his face a contorted mask of agony. Eleanor's training, her caution, her fear, it all dissolved. There was only her child. She moved silently to the other side of the bed. Alistair was so focused on Theo that he did not notice her. Her gaze was locked on her son's face. Oh, my love, my poor lost love. She did not think, she acted. She reached out a hand, chapped and rough from lye soap, and laid it on Theo's forehead. And she began to sing. It was not a song she had sung in the drawing rooms of London. It was not a grand aria or a fashionable ballad. It was a simple folk song her own grandmother had sung to her, a tune from the misty hills of her childhood home, a song of lost lambs and shepherdesses, of stars watching over the fold. Her voice was not the polished instrument it had once been. It was lower now, roughened by grief and hardship, but it was clear and pure. It cut through the boy's frantic screams like a silver bell in a storm. Theo froze, his thrashing stilled, his wails choked off into ragged, hiccuping breaths. His wide, terrified eyes, so like her own, swiveled to fix on her face. He stared at her, his little chest heaving. Alistair had gone rigid. He had heard that voice. He had heard that song. It was impossible. He turned his head slowly, every muscle in his neck protesting. His eyes fell upon the scullery maid. A thin, worn woman in a drab grey dress, her hair hidden beneath a plain white cap. He had passed her a dozen times in the corridors, her face always downcast, another anonymous servant. But the voice, the song, his mind refused to make the connection. It was a phantom, a cruel trick of his grief-addicted brain. He was hallucinating. But then the maid brushed a stray lock of hair from Theo's forehead, and he saw her hand, a long, elegant hand, despite the redness and a small, faded scar on the index finger where she had cut herself on a rose thorn in the gardens years ago. He remembered tending to it himself, in a rare moment of tenderness between them. His gaze shot up to her face. He looked past the exhaustion, past the hollows in her cheeks, past the drab uniform of servitude. He looked into her eyes, the color of a summer sky. The world tilted. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. The carefully constructed reality of the last 4 years did not just crack. It exploded into dust. Eleanor! The name was a ghost on his lips, a breath of disbelief. She flinched as if struck. Her song faltered and died. Her hand flew from Theo's forehead as if burned. The spell was broken. Terror, stark and absolute, flooded her eyes. She looked from the Duke's stunned face to her son, who was now staring at them both with a dawning, fragile hope. She had to run. She turned, ready to bolt from the room, to disappear back into the shadow she had inhabited for so long, but a hand shot out and caught her wrist. Not hard, not cruelly, but with a grip of iron desperation. "No," Alistair breathed, his voice raw. He rose to his full height, towering over her, but his face was not angry. It was a mask of utter, shattered confusion. "You will not." He pulled her around to face him. The cap had slipped, and a cascade of honey-colored hair, the hair he had once loved to see spread across a pillow, tumbled free. It was her, thinner, older, broken. But it was her, Eleanor, his wife, the woman he had publicly shamed, accused of the vilest betrayal, and cast out like refuse, standing in his son's nursery, dressed as a servant. The silence that descended was no longer empty. It was thick with the weight of 4 years of lies, of pain, of unspoken words. It was the silence of a tomb that had just been cracked open. Theo, forgotten for a moment, pushed himself up on his elbows. He looked at the strange, sad woman his father was holding. He looked at her face, then back at his father's. A single hopeful word escaped his lips. "Mama?" The word struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. A sob, thick and painful, tore from her throat. She tried to wrench her arm free, a wild, trapped animal. "Let me go," she hissed, her voice a ragged whisper, all traces of the lullaby gone, replaced by pure, distilled fury. "You have no right." "No right?" Alistair's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. He was drowning. The floor beneath him was gone. He was falling through years of self-deception. "You are in my house, with my son, dressed as a maid." "He is my son," she spat, her eyes flashing with a fire he had not seen since the day he condemned her. "Mine, the one you stole from me. The one I—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The accusation was so monstrous, so inverted from the narrative he had clung to, that his mind could not process it. He had been the wronged party. He had been the one betrayed. The evidence, the letters. Marcus. Marcus. His cousin's face swam before his eyes. Marcus, who had brought him the damning letters. Marcus, who had counseled him to be firm, to cut out the poison before it tainted the Blackwood name. Marcus, who had been his shadow, his confidant, his most trusted adviser ever since. For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, pierced the armor of his certainty. He looked at Eleanor's face, at the raw agony and righteous fury etched there. Liars did not look like this. The guilty did not have eyes that burned with such fierce, protective love for the child they had supposedly abandoned. "The letters," he said, his voice hoarse. "You wrote the letters." Eleanor laughed, a sound devoid of all humor. It was the sound of a heart breaking all over again. "Oh, you are still clinging to that, the perfect excuse for your cruelty. Did it ever once occur to you in your cold, ducal pride to ask me, to look me in the eye and ask if it was true?" He had not. He had taken Marcus's word. He had looked at the forged proof, his own simmering resentment at their emotionally distant marriage providing fertile ground for suspicion, and he had passed sentence without a trial. He had been judge, jury, and executioner, and he had been wrong. The realization did not dawn. It struck him like lightning, leaving him scorched and shaking. He had been utterly, catastrophically wrong. He had not just made a mistake. He had destroyed his family based on a lie he had been all too willing to believe. His grip on her wrist loosened. His hand fell away as if it had lost all strength. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time in 4 years. Not as the adulterous duchess of his imagination, but as a woman who had survived an unspeakable injustice. The fine bones of her face were more prominent. The delicate skin beneath her eyes was bruised with exhaustion. Her hands were the hands of a laborer. He had done this to her. "What have I done?" he whispered, the words addressed to the universe, to the ghosts in the room, to the wreckage of his life. Eleanor saw the shift in his eyes, the collapse of his certainty. For a fleeting moment she felt a vicious surge of triumph. but it was quickly replaced by a bone-deep weariness. It was too late, 4 years too late. "You condemned me," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now let me go. I will leave. I will not trouble you or your fine house again. I had to see him." "Leave?" The word was absurd. Go where? Back to the life of drudgery he had forced upon her. The thought was intolerable. "No, you are not leaving." He moved, blocking the door. He was no longer the confused, shattered man of a moment ago. A new, terrifying clarity was taking hold. The problem was not his son's nightmares. The problem was not a disobedient wife. The problem was a monstrous lie, and he was standing at its epicenter. "You will stay," he commanded, the old ducal arrogance returning, but this time it was fueled by desperation, not pride. "Stay?" she repeated, her voice rising with incredulous fury. "As what? Your prisoner? A ghost to haunt your halls? You threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. You told the world I was a whore. You let my family believe I had shamed them into an early grave. And now you command me to stay?" "I will put it right," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "You cannot put it right," she cried, and this time the tears came, hot and angry. "You cannot give me back those years. You cannot undo the hunger, the cold, the fear. You cannot give me back the first time my son said my name, his first steps, the 1,000 nights I have laid awake, wondering if he was warm, if he was safe, if he even remembered me. Every word was a lash, and Alistair stood and took it. He deserved it. He deserved so much more. From the bed, a small voice cut through the storm. "Are you my mama?" They both turned. Thea was sitting up, his small face a canvas of confusion and hope. He was looking at Eleanor, his eyes wide and searching. Eleanor's anger dissolved into pure, aching love. She moved to the bed and knelt, bringing herself to his level. She reached out and cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs gently stroking his pale cheeks. "Yes, my darling," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I am your mama." Theo's face crumpled. He threw his small arms around her neck and buried his face in her shoulder, his body shaking with silent, relieved sobs. Eleanor wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, breathing in the scent of him, the lost scent of her baby. It was a homecoming and a heartbreak all at once. Alistair watched them, a solitary figure by the door. He was outside of their circle of grief and reunion. He had no place there. He was the architect of their pain, the jailer who had kept them apart. The silence in the room was now filled with the sound of his son's quiet weeping and his wife's soothing murmurs. It was the most beautiful and painful sound he had ever heard. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his penance was just beginning. Forgiveness was a distant, impossible shore. First, there had to be a reckoning, and it would begin with his cousin Marcus. He backed out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving mother and son to their reunion. He walked down the grand staircase, his steps echoing in the vast, empty space. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to watch him, their painted eyes full of judgment. He had failed the name, he had failed his wife, he had failed his son. He went to his study, the room that had always been his sanctuary, his fortress of power. It now felt like a cage. He strode to the heavy mahogany desk and unlocked a small, ornate box. Inside lay a packet of letters tied with a black ribbon, the proof of Eleanor's betrayal. He untied the ribbon and spread them out under the lamp. He had not looked at them in 4 years. He had not needed to. He had accepted them as gospel. Now he looked with new eyes, eyes unclouded by anger and pride. He saw the slight inconsistencies in the handwriting, a flourish on a T that was not quite Eleanor's. He saw the phrasing, a turn of a romantic phrase that was too clumsy, too direct for her subtle, intelligent prose. He remembered her letters to him during their courtship, full of wry observations and delicate wit. These were crude forgeries. A child could see it, a blind, stupid child. He swept the letters from the desk with a roar of pure rage. They fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The silence he had cultivated for 4 years was now screaming at him. He had to get her back. Not the Duchess of Blackwood, not the mistress of his house. Eleanor, the woman he had wronged, and he had no idea how. Grand gestures would be an insult. Apologies were empty air. He could not buy back what he had stolen from her. He had to earn it. He spent the rest of the night in that chair, not sleeping, just thinking. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of grey and rose. He had a plan. It was not a plan for reconciliation. It was a plan for atonement. The next morning, the house was buzzing. The staff had seen the Duke emerge from the nursery in the dead of night, his face like a thundercloud. They had heard the raised voices. They knew the new scullery maid, Nora, had not returned to her cot in the attic. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, found Alistair in his study. He looked as if he had aged 10 years overnight. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, "there is talk." "Let them talk," he said, his voice rough. Is she—" "The Duchess is with Master Theodore, Mrs." Gable said, pointedly using the correct title. "He has not left her side. He slept through the dawn, Your Grace, for the first time in a year." The simple statement hit Alistair harder than any accusation. "I see." He looked at the formidable housekeeper. She had served his father before him. Her eyes missed nothing. "You knew." "It was not my place to speak, Your Grace," she replied, her expression unreadable. "It was your place to see." The rebuke was gentle but sharp as a razor. He accepted it. "Prepare the Sutherland suite for her. See that she has everything she needs. Clothes, books, whatever she requires. And Mrs. Gable? Your Grace? She is not to be treated as a prisoner. She is free to go wherever she pleases within the house and grounds, but she is not to leave Blackwood. Do you understand?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." Eleanor, however, had other ideas. When Mrs. Gable arrived at the nursery with a tray of food and news of the Duke's orders, Eleanor's response was swift and unequivocal. "No." She sat in a rocking chair by the window, Theo curled in her lap, fast asleep. His small hand was fisted in the rough fabric of her dress. She looked exhausted but resolute. "I will not stay in a gilded cage of his making," she told the housekeeper, her voice low but firm. "I am not his Duchess. I am Nora, the scullery maid, and when my son is strong enough, we will be leaving." "He will not permit it, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable warned gently. "He does not get to permit or deny me anything ever again," Eleanor retorted. "He gave up that right 4 years ago." The standoff lasted for 3 days. Eleanor refused to leave the nursery. She ate the simple meals Mrs. Gable brought her. She bathed and cared for Theo, and she sang to him. The nursery, once a place of terror, became a sanctuary. The sound of her soft singing and quiet laughter drifted into the hallway, a constant, painful reminder to Alistair of the life he had destroyed. He did not approach her. He knew it would be useless. Instead, he worked. He sent a rider to London with a message for his solicitor and another for a man named Mr. Jones, an inquiry agent of discreet and formidable reputation. On the 4th day, he made his first move. He did not go to the nursery. He went to the kitchens. He walked in just as the staff were sitting down for their midday meal. A sudden, shocked silence fell over the room. The Duke had not set foot in the kitchens in 20 years. He ignored the stunned faces and walked directly to the empty place at the long wooden table. The place where Nora used to sit. He looked at the simple wooden stool, the pewter plate, the worn knife. He imagined her sitting there, day after day, while he resided in splendor just a few floors above. He turned to the staff. "The woman you knew as Nora," he said, his voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room, "is Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood, my wife. She was wrongly accused and unjustly cast out. I was deceived, and I have failed her and this house." A collective gasp went through the room. "The lie that separated us ends today," he continued, his gaze sweeping over them. "She will be restored to her rightful place. Any person who speaks a word against her, who treats her with anything less than the utmost respect due to her station, will be dismissed from my service immediately. Is that understood?" A chorus of mumbled, "Yes, Your Grace," answered him. He gave a curt nod and left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving a whirlwind of gossip and astonishment in his wake. He had not done it for them. He had done it for her. He knew word would reach her within minutes. It was not an apology, it was a public declaration. A first brick laid in the foundation of a new reality. That evening, he went to the nursery. He did not knock, he simply entered. Eleanor was sitting by the fire, reading to Theo from a book of fairy tales. She looked up as he entered, her expression wary. Theo, seeing his father, scrambled to hide behind her chair. The simple, instinctive action was another twist of the knife in Alistair's heart. He did not approach them. He stopped just inside the door. "I have something for you," he said. He held out a small, velvet-wrapped object. Eleanor stared at it, then at him, her eyes full of suspicion. "I want nothing from you." "It is not from me," he said. "It is yours." He placed it on a small table near the door and retreated. After a long moment, her curiosity got the better of her. She rose and went to the table. She unwrapped the velvet to reveal a simple silver locket, tarnished with age. Her breath caught. It was her locket, the one her mother had given her, with the pressed primrose inside. She had been forced to sell it 2 years ago, in a harsh winter when she could not find work, to buy medicine for a fever. It had broken her heart. She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "My agent, Mr. Jones, is a very resourceful man," Alistair said quietly. "He tracked it to a pawn shop in York. The shopkeeper remembered you." Tears welled in her eyes, not of gratitude, but of renewed pain. He had invaded her past, dug up the bones of her misery. Yet, he had brought her back a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. She clutched the locket in her hand, the cool metal a familiar weight. "This changes nothing," she whispered. "I know," he said. "It is just a beginning." The next week was a slow, painful dance. Alistair began the systematic dismantling of the lie. Mr. Jones arrived from London with a full report. The forger, a disgraced clerk with a gambling habit, was found and under pressure confessed to being paid by Marcus Beaumont. The fictional lover from the letters was proven to be a man who had been dead for 6 months before the letters were supposedly written. The evidence was irrefutable, a mountain of proof of Marcus's treachery. Alistair summoned his cousin to Blackwood. Marcus arrived in high spirits, expecting to find Alistair still mired in misery. He walked into the study to find not just Alistair, but his solicitor and Mr. Jones. The forged letters and the forger's signed confession were laid out on the desk. The color drained from Marcus's face. He tried to bluster, to deny, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Why?" Alistair asked, his voice dangerously calm. "She never did you any harm." Marcus, cornered and exposed, finally dropped the mask of civility. His face twisted into a sneer of pure, venomous resentment. "She was in my way," he spat. "You, with your title and your lands, you had everything, but you were weak. You let a woman with no connections, a country nobody, occupy the place that should have been for a wife who could advance us. And then she gave you an heir. My chances were dwindling. I did what was necessary." "Necessary," Alistair repeated, the word tasting like poison. He looked at the man he had once called brother, and saw nothing but a hollow shell of ambition and greed. "You are no longer a Beaumont," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a temperature of pure ice. "Your name will be struck from the family records. Your allowance is terminated. You will leave this house within the hour. If you are ever seen on Blackwood land again, I will have you prosecuted for trespassing. If you ever speak my wife's name again, I will personally see you ruined in a way you cannot even imagine. Now get out." The downfall of Marcus Beaumont was swift and total. He was socially and financially annihilated. Alistair made sure the truth, or at least a version of it that cleared Eleanor's name completely, was circulated among the ton. The Duchess had been the victim of a cruel and elaborate hoax by a desperate relative. The Duke, in his grief, had been tragically misled. It was a story society could understand and accept, but Eleanor was not society. She had watched the proceedings from a distance, a silent observer in her own vindication. She felt a cold, distant satisfaction at Marcus's ruin, but it did not heal the wounds. Alistair did not press her. He gave her space. He took over the Sutherland suite himself, sleeping on a couch in the sitting room, leaving her the master bedroom. He began to court her, not with jewels and grand promises, but with small, consistent acts of service. He learned her routine. He knew she liked her tea with a single lump of sugar. A cup would be waiting for her when she woke. He learned that she suffered from headaches, a lingering consequence of years of poor nutrition. A special blend of herbs, recommended by a London apothecary, would appear on her bedside table. He started spending time with Theo. It was clumsy at first. He did not know how to play, how to speak the language of a 5-year-old. He would sit on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by toys, feeling more out of place than he had ever felt in the House of Lords. Eleanor watched him. She saw him try to build a tower of blocks, only to have Theo knock it down. She saw him try to read a story, his deep baritone stumbling over the silly rhymes. She saw the frustration and the shame on his face, but she also saw that he did not give up. He came back day after day, enduring his son's suspicion and his own inadequacy. One afternoon, she found him in the garden, on his hands and knees in the dirt, showing Theo how to find earthworms. Theo was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, that had been absent from the house for 4 years. Alistair looked up and saw her watching, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He did not look like a duke. He looked like a father. A small, cautious hope began to bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. That night, a storm rolled in, rattling the window panes. Theo, startled from a deep sleep, cried out, not in terror, but in simple fear of the noise. Before Eleanor could move, Alistair was there. He had been sleeping in the chair by the fire. He went to Theo's bed and sat on the edge. "It is only the wind, son," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's telling the trees stories." "What kind of stories?" Theo asked, his fear already subsiding. "Stories of old castles and brave knights," Alistair said, improvising, "and of a little prince who was so brave not even a storm could frighten him." He stayed there, telling his son a rambling, fantastical story until the boy's breathing evened out and he fell back asleep. He did not sing, he did not have the magic of a lullaby, but he had found his own way to soothe the fear. Eleanor lay in her bed in the adjoining room listening. She heard the change in him. The pride was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady patience. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a humility she had never thought him capable of. The next morning, she came down for breakfast. For the first time, she did not take her meal in the nursery or her suite. She went to the small sunlit morning room where the family took their informal meals. Alistair was there reading the paper. He looked up, his expression guarded. He had not expected this. She walked to the table and took the seat opposite him. "Good morning, Alistair," she said, her voice clear and calm. It was the first time she had used his name. The word hung in the air between them, full of unspoken meaning. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was an opening. A door cracked ajar. "Good morning, Eleanor," he replied, his heart aching with a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, hope. They ate in silence, but it was not the oppressive, angry silence of the past. It was a contemplative silence, a space for breathing. After breakfast, she said, "I would like to walk in the rose garden." "Of course," he said, rising immediately. "I will have a maid fetch your shawl." "That will not be necessary," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I would like you to accompany me." It was a test and a gift. They walked through the gardens, the autumn air crisp and cool. They did not speak of the past. They spoke of the roses, of the changing leaves, of Theo's newfound fascination with insects. It was simple, normal conversation, and it felt more profound than any apology. As they reached the old stone bench where he had once tended to her cut finger, she stopped. She turned to him, her sky-blue eyes clear and searching. "I cannot forget what happened, Alistair," she said softly. "The years of pain are a part of me now. They are scars." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I would not ask you to." "But the anger," she continued, taking a deep breath, "it is fading. When I look at you now, I do not see the man who condemned me. I see the man who is trying to build a tower of blocks for his son." She reached out and took his hand. His was large and warm, enveloping hers. "Blackwood is my home," she said. "Theo is my son, and you are my husband. I am willing to see if we can build something new on the ruins of what we had." Tears streamed down Alistair's face, hot and unchecked. He did not try to hide them. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of reverence and gratitude. "I will spend the rest of my life earning this, Eleanor," he vowed. "I will not fail you again." That evening the house was quiet. The silence was no longer a weight. It was a gentle, peaceful blanket. Alistair came to her rooms and found her standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds. Theo was asleep in his own bed, in his own room, the door ajar, but not in fear. "He did not cry for me tonight," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "He just hugged me and went to sleep." "He knows you are here," Alistair said, coming to stand beside her. "He knows he is safe." They stood together, not touching, but closer than they had been in years. The house was finally at peace. The nightmares were over. The Duke had his Duchess back, and in the quiet, shared space between them, a new love, stronger and more resilient than the first, was finally beginning to grow.